Someone's gonna pick this up, right?
All right, campers. Look, we all knew this one was inevitable. Total Drama is a series full of absolute ruthlessness on so many levels, and all of that ruthlessness can be traced back to its absolute sadist of a host, Chris McLean. I'm Keefe Enosi with Wicked Binge, and today we're taking a trip to Camp Wawanakwa for Chris McLean's deeds, good to evil. Like usual, we'll start off with Chris's good deeds, and it's been a while since we've had to stretch this far for someone. The Bronze Medal of Good, or good by Chris's standards anyway, goes to his deed of paying off Owen's debt. We're not gonna act like this was some noble deed on his part. Chris bringing Owen back as a mole was done primarily to stir up drama for the sake of those sweet ratings, after all.
Let's get this speed eating contest started!
But if nothing else, there was the after effect of his payment to Owen reimbursing his family's debt from buying a massive cheese seller. Like we said, we're really stretching for this dude. Taking the silver medal of good is Chris's friendship with Chef Hatchet. Whether you believe these two are BFFs or inevitable soon-to-be lovers, or even if you subscribe to the one theory that Chef is a government-appointed caretaker for Chris, it's clear that Chef Hatchet is one of the few people Chris seems to genuinely care for. That's not to say Chef is never the target of Chris's sadistic tendencies, of course, but it is to say that he values Chef enough to feel genuine sadness when he temporarily quits in the finale of Total Drama Action.
Chef's leaving the show!
Chef also holds Chris back occasionally from his more child murdery tendencies, showing that Chris has enough respect for him, and the higher-up execs, or maybe just their money, to at least occasionally acquiesce there. Taking perhaps the least impressive gold medal of good deeds we've ever given out is Chris's very occasional concern for others. Look, Chris McLean is a bad guy. Understatement, really, but there are a few occasions where he's shown some sincere goodwill towards others, kinda. The most memorable is probably in the episode Sunday Muddy Sunday, in which Chris calls out Courtney for trying to basically poison his interns.
They should thank me.
Granted, this was after starving them, and before he continued to starve them, now that I'm thinking about it, but it still sort of counts, right? There's also the time Chris was fearful of the possibility that his contestants might all drown in Master of Disasters, and was genuinely overjoyed when Harold saved them. Even if this was in part due to concern for the show being cancelled, it's still a far cry from the outright sadism the guy usually exhibits. But really, come on, you all know what you clicked for with a character like Chris, so let's start talking about the bad to evil deeds. Let's start with the straightforward and obvious one, sadism. This might be the one that requires the least explanation. I mean, come on, it's like Chris's whole thing. He's pretty open about how much he enjoys causing pain to the multitude of children he features on his shows.
Owen's fine. A little broken jaw.
Naturally, we'll get to more specific examples, but for now, just know that Chris genuinely enjoys every deed he commits on this list, a facet of his character which deserves an entry in and of itself. Indicative of the rest of the list's level of insanity is the fact that Chris having sex with a plant is only our second entry in the bad territory. Today we learned what dendrophilia means. It's the scientific name for sexual attraction to plants, literally meaning love of trees. Were it not for the All-Stars episode, No One Expects the Spanish Opposition, I personally would have never known this was a thing.
So, I hope some of you get really hurt.
But when Chris unleashes a Little Shop of Horrors reference on the cast, it gives birth to some little plant babies, one of which resembles Chris to a sincerely concerning degree. If you can't put the rest of the puzzle together, let us help. Chris banged the plant. He gave Larry some extra fertilizer that fateful day. And it's 10 times creepier when you remember Chris mentioned that he raised Larry on one occasion. Now let's talk about the psychological warfare Chris engaged in against many of his contestants. Chris has no issue using his impressionable teenage contestants' emotional vulnerability to his advantage, and of course, that of those sweet, sweet ratings.
Never play a player.
The most memorable example we can think of is Dave. In the finale of Pakato Island, he uses Sky's confessional to convince Dave that she's had a boyfriend this entire time, even knowing that Sky had dumped him before his time on the show, and that Dave has been shown to be very unstable. This ultimately results in Dave snapping and trying to kill Sky in the final challenge. Oh, and bonus points to Chris for leaving Dave behind at the end. It's possible that they went back for him, granted, but much less probable that Chris was the one to decide to do so. And of course, let's not forget the time Chris destroyed the ecosystem, for the ratings. In Revenge of the Island, the whole shtick is a return to the original Camp Wawanakwa setting, with a twist.
For real?
This twist, of course, being the fact that Chris allowed so much toxic waste to pile up in the waters of the island that the local wildlife was highly mutated, from the infamous two-legged shark Fang to the gigantic spiders, etc., etc. Chris is fully aware of the danger and horror terror he causes to both the local wildlife and his younger contestants, but like with pretty much everything else this man does, Chris just took in the torment and enjoyed it, leading to plenty of problems for the wildlife and the contestants. On that note, let's discuss Chris ruining the lives of multiple contestants. Sure, multiple contestants could be said to have horrible trauma from their time on the island, but for this entry specifically, we're going to focus most closely on Dakota and Ezekiel. Dakota was turned into a gigantic monster by the island's toxic ooze, to which Chris showed absolutely no remorse, as usual.
She's gonna be fine!
These changes were absolutely irreversible, as were Ezekiel's, apparently, who Chris not only bullied off in the first episode of World Tour, but used his newfound feral state as an obstacle for challenges rather than even trying to get a medical or psychological help. But as far as injuries go, nothing compares to what happened to Scott. Scott was one of the most refreshingly blunt villains over the course of the Total Drama series. This unapologetic jerk definitely deserved some comeuppance, but maybe the full body cast was enough?
Yep. Definitely overstimulated.
Well, Chris wouldn't agree. At his elimination, Chris gets back at Scott for accidentally fleeing him into the outhouses by having his archenemy Fang tag along in the hurl of shame. Yes, Chris placed a live, angry, air-breathing shark in a catapult with a teenager who was already pretty much immobile. This results in Scott being placed in an iron lung, and in audiences being mildly traumatized by seeing this guy, whose worst deed was being kind of a jerk, turned into a brain-dead half-corpse. And this grown man laughing at him with no remorse for how he absolutely mutilated a kid. Taking home Chris's bronze medal of evil is his habit of just straight up torturing his contestants. We've already talked about how much Chris enjoys causing others pain, but now let's talk about the action that overlies that drive. Chris's penchant for causing pain is shown as early as the 3rd episode of the show, where Chris's challenge is seeing which contestant can stay awake the longest.
That is so crazy incredible!
Causing them pain isn't limited to just exhausting them mentally though, it's also physical exhaustion, like in the reboot when one of his challenges was having the teens stand atop giant poles in sweltering heat, all while starving them and tempting them with food and even money. Chris is more than willing to cause his contestants pain and suffering for the sake of ratings. In fact, he seems to find it concerningly fun, even describing the contestants as the people he loves to hurt. You just know we're dealing with an absolute demon when Chris's, let's call them Herbert tendencies, are only at our silver medal of evil. Yeah, that's right. We're going from Total Drama Island to Total Epstein Island to talk about Chris's disturbing tastes. From the very first episode, he's shown a particular interest in Lindsay, clearly favoring her over other contestants and even tagging along with her on the boat of losers at her elimination. He also holds Gwen uncomfortably close to him in the end of one episode, despite her clear discomfort.
See all you groovy cats next time!
The fact that the game show's bathrooms have cameras in them for confessionals is also very concerning in this context, but at least some of that can only be chalked up to speculation. The gold medal of evil goes to a trait that leaves nothing up to the imagination: repeated child endangerment. Not to downplay the last deed at all, but let's face it, this list would never be complete without a mention of just how many times Chris has placed the teens' lives in legitimate jeopardy. It went from a casualty of having ruthless challenges, from the very first one of cliff jumping into a river of sharks onwards, to something Chris genuinely wants to do. In the reboot, he's a lot more tongue-in-cheek about it, directly saying on multiple occasions that he hopes to see the contestants hurt, or even killed, and feels genuine disappointment when they aren't.
I'm doing it on purpose.
We've done videos ranking his most gruesome challenges in the past, and you know what? The fact that we have multiple videos of that format, and still potential for more, should speak for itself. Chris is an absolute menace to society. At that point, you have to wonder if the money's even worth it. Wait, sorry, I almost forgot Chris's real worst deed: eliminating Mr. Coconut. We all know darn well he deserved to win.